The panel is titled Dealing with Anti-Refugee / Migrant Sentiments. I'm the Yasuyuki Matsunaga from Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. We have done 3 presenters, each dealing with different contexts. The first one deals with the Southeast Asian context, second one European, the third one is Japanese context. The profiles of the presenters in the brochure, so let's not waste time trying to read it. But the first presenter, Theophilus Kwek, he's from Singapore, I believe. Currently based in here, but previously he was in England and got his BA and MA. Master's degree is in refugees and forced migration studies. And then his presentation is titled Southeast Asian States' Responses to the Rohingya Crisis. Okay, who is yours?
Thanks. Hello? Hello, can everyone hear me? Awesome. Could I have my presentation? Great. Okay, so I don't have very much time, so we'll just jump right in. Thank you so much to the MEI and to the Center for Relational Studies for this invitation. And to those who are not from Singapore, welcome to Singapore and welcome to Southeast Asia. So as you'll see from this rough sketch map on the slide, this is Southeast Asia. It's a region that is known perhaps for many things, but is not known for its hospitality to its refugees or forced migrants. And we're going to talk a little bit today about both the history of this, the reasons for this, and the kinds of narratives that states continue to tell about this, and how those narratives structure public policy going forward. So, Southeast Asia has had, broadly speaking, a restrictionist history towards refugees and forced migrants. We have the most notable crisis, especially to the field of refugee studies or forced migration studies, is that of the the Indo-Chinese refugee crisis in the 70s, continuing on through the 80s, and finally coming to a kind of conclusion in the 90s. But throughout this entire period, of course, many of us in the room will be familiar with the restrictionist attitudes promoted by many Southeast Asian countries towards Indo-Chinese refugees. And the restrictionist attitudes and policies were accompanied by a rhetoric of pragmatism. For most countries, there was short-term national development and security needs that trumped any idea of obligations towards refugees or taking in refugees. In addition to Vietnam, of course, and there was the Comprehensive Plan of Action, we also have other displaced populations in Southeast Asia who, like the Indo-Chinese refugees, have not found long-term resettlement or long-term asylum within the region. Many of them have relied on alternatives such as resettlement outside of the region, strategies of invisibility and integration within the region, or simply long-term protracted displacement, such as the refugees on the Thai-Burmese border. In fact, the refugees on the Thai-Burmese border form the world's longest and largest protracted displacement situation, with some camps that are there having been open since 1984. So what we have in Southeast Asia over the entire period, and I'm looking at the post-war independent history of many current Southeast Asian regimes, is a very close restrictionist attitude towards forced migrants. Why is this so? We have 2 main explanations in the literature to why this is so. The first is an institution-driven explanation. And this explanation relies on a little bit of what we have just discussed of the differences between quote-unquote Western and quote-unquote non-Western, especially Asian views towards asylum and resettlement. One scholar in particular, Sarah Davies, among others, promotes the view that it was because institutions like the Refugee Convention and global resettlement systems are Eurocentric and do not take into account Asian understandings of what asylum means or what refugeehood means, that Southeast Asian countries have decided not to sign up to these agreements. And this is an institutionalist explanation that goes beyond the Refugee Convention alone, right? It continues on to being willing to host UNHCR operations or support UNHCR operations within the region. However, I think this institution-driven explanation is not enough to explain why Southeast Asian countries are not friendly towards refugees. Well, for one, it relies on an assumption of Asian distinctiveness or Southeast Asian distinctiveness. And the boundaries of Southeast Asia are famously porous conceptually as well as in terms of international relations. And there are many, many examples of other Asian countries that, without signing up to the Refugee Convention, have in fact either evolved alternative mechanisms for dealing with displaced populations or hosted displaced populations on an informal basis. And India is a huge example of this. India not only hosts and supports a variety of UNHCR operations, of course, with some exceptions. India also plays host on a tacit basis, certainly not an explicit basis, but on a tacit basis, to large populations of displaced communities. And while I'm aware that the Indian example is a flawed one, it does certainly contrast with the much more restrictionist attitudes of Southeast Asian countries, both in rhetoric and in practice. Institutions alone might not explain why Southeast Asian countries have restrictionist attitudes towards forced migrants. But how about interests? The realist explanation would tell us that countries in Southeast Asia, especially countries who perceive themselves to be developing or within the third world, have vested interest in prioritizing national development needs over the rights claims of non-nationals. Realists also tell us that with particular kinds of security concerns within the region, in the 70s during the Indo-Chinese crisis, this was a concern with being at the receiving end of the Cold War kind of domino logic. And in the present day, of course, these security concerns extend to ethnic conflict or terrorism. But security concerns themselves, as well as broader kind of realist understandings of why we should expand migration policies, why we should take in forced migrants, are perhaps also not any more complete than institution-driven explanations in telling us why this is so. Realist explanations fall short on three main failings. First, they do not explain why states occasionally act against their interests. At the ASEAN-Europe Summit, for example, when Myanmar's policies towards its minority populations was tied to lots of economic advantages of cooperation with Europe, ASEAN states chose to side with Myanmar against their economic interests. So this is one case in which issue linkages or the creation of new interests seem not to be effective in shaping ASEAN policy. The two other reasons why interest-driven explanations fall short are these. They do not explain why some institutions develop, like the Convention Against Trafficking, but not others. And they don't explain they don't explain how states' interests are framed. So many states in Southeast Asia will say things like, we're not going to take in refugees, but they frame them in all sorts of different ways. Some states say that, oh, it's because, well, human rights don't exist in Southeast Asia. Other states say things like, it's because this particular problem is Myanmar's problem, it's not our problem. And the different strategies that states use to frame their policies cannot simply be explained by looking at what their interests are. So in this presentation today, I'm going to look a little bit more closely at rhetoric. During my research, I took a critical discourse analysis of policy statements, speeches, interviews given to the press, news reports, a lot of very boring press releases, and tried to come up with an understanding of the narratives that Southeast Asian states tell about refugees and forced migrants. But why is studying rhetoric important? Studying rhetoric helps us to frame states' actions against their discursive context, rather than what we assume about their interests. Singapore's interests today, for example, are very, very different from Singapore's interests in 1967. But often an essentialist understanding of what a state's interests are is used to try to forge an explanation of why they are unfriendly towards forced migrants. Studying rhetoric also helps us to avoid essentializing states' responses as non-Western or Asian. It helps us to think about how specific politicians rooted in local discursive contexts understand the challenges that are set before them. And finally, rhetoric helps us to understand how institutions themselves are sometimes the product of discourse. It's not always rhetoric that is the product of institutions, but some institutions grow out of rhetoric that we repeat to others and to ourselves. So rhetoric is important, not least, of course, in Southeast Asia, famously, because Southeast Asian politicians love talking. Now, Southeast Asia has been dismissed by critics, especially in the field of realist international relations elsewhere, as a talk shop. And one of the things I'd like to argue today is that those who do so miss the point. In Southeast Asia, as many of us are well aware, I'm sure, talking is often the point. Talking is work. It is through talk and through debate, through discussion, that norms are formed, that arguments for policies are made and justified both to each other as well as to local populations. And ASEAN politicians themselves are famous for seeing rhetoric as important. They are famous for saying, yeah, you know, this morning I could call up, say, Foreign Minister Rajaratnam and discuss this over breakfast. And that dialogue was the basis of policy. And if politicians themselves see rhetoric as important, we might try to start taking them at their word. Among the different schools of international relations, realists and liberals have focused on power distributions and domestic interests respectively, but actually even constructivists haven't been that good at taking rhetoric on board as a serious side of analysis. Many constructivists in Southeast Asia look at norms and state actions, what states do instead of what states say, as evidence for how norms diffuse through the region. It's only the English School of International Relations, I would say wrongly called English, that treats or takes seriously the idea of the international society, how states socialize each other and themselves through dialogue. So using some insights from the English School, I'm going to look at three narratives today. These three narratives are nested in very specific Southeast Asian contexts, and we're going to see what those are. So the first narrative, sorry, excuse me. The first narrative that we're going to look at is containment. Now, containment is not a narrative that's unique to Southeast Asia. Containment refers to framing crisis, especially crisis of displacement, as domestic problems. It locates both crisis and the solutions to crisis in countries of origin. And this promotes, on the part of the states that do this, it promotes short-term and offshore responses. So, for example, instead of saying, yes, I'm going to take in X number of Rohingya refugees, we are going to send aid to Rakhine State. We are going to help them build schools or whatever it is. Offshore responses that are located in the country of origin rather than on-site resettlement in the host country. It's easy to see why the logic of containment, which involves putting the responsibility for a crisis on the host state, promotes this kind of response. And this rhetoric is pretty common in Southeast Asia. In fact, one of the first prominent Southeast Asian politicians to articulate this was the ASEAN Secretary General, Surin Pitsuwan, in 2015, where he said Myanmar has to demonstrate that it can resolve its own internal complexities. And this was then echoed by Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, who said countries of origin have to tackle these problems and minimize the hardships for their own, quote-unquote, their own refugees. And Cambodia's Prime Minister Hun Sen jumped on the bandwagon shortly afterwards, and he said, this is an internal issue for Myanmar, and we disagree with internationalizing the issue. So the narrative of containment, so these are just some choice excerpts, as it were, but there are many other politicians at various levels who have echoed containment in one shape or form. And where does containment come from? Where does this idea come from, and how does it take root in Southeast Asia? Now, containment, of course, is not an idea that's unique to Southeast Asia in any way. In fact, the root causes rhetoric of migration studies goes way beyond Southeast Asia. And the root causes discourse involves, as I've said, locating crisis at their source, at the roots of the problem. In Southeast Asia, politicians will say things like the issue should be addressed upstream at its source, or as the Thai Deputy Prime Minister put it, we seek to stop the outflow and address the root causes of the issue. The interesting thing is not so much that this root causes discourse exists, because it does, but how it justifies policy in Southeast Asia. So in Thailand, for example, this root causes dynamic is used to justify the increase of Navy deployment to stop the outflow of refugees, as it were, to contain refugees in Myanmar's waters. So that statement that was made by the Thai Prime Minister, which I just quoted, was actually in a speech that was used to justify the increase of Navy deployment. And the Royal Thai Navy was sent on a quote-unquote humanitarian mission to stop ships from coming into Thai waters, to stop refugee boats from coming into Thai waters, based on this root causes argument. But within Southeast Asia, of course, we also have some regional norms that lend themselves to this idea of containment. We have the norm of non-interference, and various scholars have shown that non-interference is very much a rhetorical norm in Southeast Asia. It doesn't always take shape in practice. But what we are looking at the level of rhetoric is how the norm of non-interference is transformed in this particular scenario, responding to the Rohingya crisis, as a norm of containment. And in fact, Malaysia's Prime Minister Najib Razak explicitly linked Malaysia's non-action at the time, this was in late 2014, to the ASEAN norm of non-interference. He said, look, we are being a good ASEAN country in not interfering in Myanmar's affairs by not taking in any refugees. Because to take in Rohingya refugees would have been a criticism of what Myanmar was doing internally. So the norm of non-interference has, in this particular scenario, transformed into the narrative of containment and used to contain the Rohingya within Myanmar. I'm going to go more quickly through the next two narratives because I've been given the time signal. So the next narrative, briefly, is securitization. In Southeast Asia, there are two main sites of securitization for the Rohingya, and the first is human trafficking, and the second is terrorism. And my research focused on rhetoric that circled around terrorism. And it's interesting to see that this rhetoric developed in Southeast Asia even before evidence emerged of transnational Islamic radicalization among the Rohingya. This rhetoric was already present in the dialogues and the discourses of Southeast Asian politicians before there was any hard evidence, and there still is precious little hard evidence of Islamic radicalization among this particular community. I'm going to jump on to exceptionalism, which I think is more interesting and perhaps more familiar to many of us, especially in an East Asian context. It's the idea that human rights are realized, if at all, only within a particular regional and national Asian, quote-unquote, context. And this idea really took root during the Asian values debates of the 1990s. And within this very institution, Professor Kishore is one prominent proponent of this idea. And it promotes actually a tendency to focus on the socio-economic entitlements of nationals and not to look at the rights claims of non-nationals. This is one of the offshoots of a rights exceptionalist discourse. In fact, the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration actually affirms the right to seek and receive asylum for displaced persons. However, it makes this conditional on the laws of each individual state and on international agreements that that state has signed, effectively rendering the right to seek and enjoy asylum null and void in Southeast Asia because most countries don't have those local laws. So the effects of these within the Rohingya situation are first the selective adoption of particular rights instruments. So states are willing to jump on board the anti-trafficking bandwagon, but they're less willing to jump on board with asylum and resettlement. It also reserves for states, especially the one we're in, the right to define their own obligations. And as some very prominent public figures have said, states will do what they must. I'm deeply skeptical that human rights and democracy and ideas like that apply the same everywhere. But is there hope? All of this seems very bleak. It seems from the three narratives that we have looked at so far, that there are very strong ways of thinking that are entrenched in Southeast Asia that mean that local politicians are unlikely to change their minds. Thankfully, this is not true. And we do have two exceptions. Well, actually, we have many more than two exceptions, but we're going to look at specifically the exceptions of Indonesia and Malaysia because they've developed in a very interesting way in relation to the Rohingya crisis specifically. So in Indonesia, at the end of 2016, a new presidential decree was signed by President Jokowi that incorporated parts of the Geneva Refugee Convention into Indonesian law. And in the same way that an American presidential decree works, this was signed into executive fiat, and as such, all the executive branches of the Indonesian bureaucracy theoretically have to follow this decree. Of course, at the local level, this decree has been diluted in all sorts of different ways. So this very interesting exception seems to show that a political system can be structured in a certain way that a politician rooted in a particular context might act against narratives that are promoted by his colleagues across Southeast Asia. However, I think some of these conclusions might also be too quickly jumped to because Jokowi's predecessor, President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, actually tried to do the same thing, but was stalled by his government agencies at various points in the process. And President Jokowi was, in a way, only taking to fruition what had already been developed before. But regardless of the reasons why this exception has come about, it does prompt us to reflect on what exactly is the staying power of narratives. If there are particular regional narratives, what is the agency given to particular local politicians or particular national politicians to defy that narrative? And a more interesting case that we're going to look at now is Malaysia's. So Prime Minister Najib, seemed to make a total U-turn kind of halfway through last year when, after being battered through many rounds of Bersih protests and 1MDB scandals, took the stage at a particular political rally and took the Rohingya side. And he said very pointed statements like, I'm here in the name of the Ummah, and as a Malaysian, we want to tell Aung San Suu Kyi enough is enough. He also said things like, are you asking me to close my eyes? I can see that these human rights abuses are happening, and this is not okay. So of course we understand this in context of an embattled local politician, perhaps trying to gain some purchase among a conservative electorate. Perhaps that's one way of seeing it. And another way of seeing it might be also the activism on the part of Gulf states, especially in the OIC, the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, making overtures to both Indonesia and Malaysia as fellow quote-unquote Muslim states to act in the name of the Ummah and to receive the Rohingya on the basis of Islamic solidarity. So we do see some kind of transnational activism involved, but it does suggest that for a politician in Najib's position, it is no longer the regional narratives that make the most sense as a rhetorical tool. It's no longer that narrative that sells the best to his constituents. The narrative that sells the best is one that is based on a transnational Islamic identification or is based on a new grouping of states on religious lines, perhaps. Whether this is only with a view towards 2018's elections, I suppose we'll only find out after the elections. But it's interesting that this has developed at this time and in such a context of transnational activism. So I last presented this paper in June in London, and of course, including increasing pressure from public figures like the UN Secretary General and Canada's Justin Trudeau on ASEAN to change their stance towards the Rohingya. But at the most recent ASEAN summit, it seemed like there was all business as usual. The issue was raised by two countries. Assurances were given by the Burmese delegates, and then the issue was dropped, as it tends to be in Southeast Asia. So maybe dialogue takes a long time to take root and to take effect. But I do think that how dialogue has developed thus far across the Rohingya crisis allows us to understand what kinds of narratives sell in Southeast Asia and how those narratives need to be challenged or need to be reshaped before a more inclusive position can be taken within the region. Yep. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Next presenter is the Professor Chikako Mori. She's a sociologist at Hitotsubashi University, which is in Tokyo, Japan. She did her postgraduate studies in France, and she's a specialist on French on this particular issue. And her presentation is titled "The Securitization of Refugees and the Rise of Anti-Refugee Attitudes in France from a Threat to Social Inclusion to a Risk of Terrorism." Okay, you have 20 minutes.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Actually, I got a little bit nervous because it's very difficult to give a talk after this brilliant presentation, but I'll do my best. So before starting my presentation, I'd like to thank all of organizers, especially Professor Ho and Professor Sakai. So I am a sociologist specialized in international migration, racial discrimination, and spatial urban segregation. And as Professor Matsunaga mentioned, I conducted several researches on Muslim second-generation immigrants in France and their discrimination and segregation. But now I'm also working in a broader perspective on comparative researches of urban segregations and discrimination of ethnic minorities in France, but also in Japan and in US. But today, my presentation will focus on French case. And I slightly changed the title of my presentation. So the new one is the securitization of migrants and the rise of anti-immigrant attitude, the role of the state and immigration policies in France. Racism has become the subject of many analyses in academia, including sociology. And the growing trend in these researches is to focus on the so-called white working class voters and their angers. They have shifted their support from traditional labor political party to more xenophobic populist party. But my research is to emphasize more the role that the state plays in the rise of racism. Yesterday, Professor Sakai mentioned that one of the goals of global racial studies was to go beyond the state-based analysis. And I totally agree. But in sociology, and especially in the analysis of racism and xenophobia in democratic countries, the role of the state is not enough examined, that I think, and that is why my presentation will focus on the state. Okay. And as several speakers have already mentioned yesterday, racism on the rise was worldwide, and France isn't an exception. But what is specific with French case is probably about the gap between the reality of racism and discrimination on the one hand, and on the other hand, their self-images as human rights advocates. 2011 public opinion polls about French national identity showed that 96% of French citizens think that the most important component of their national identity is France as country of human rights. But at the same time, there was an increase in racist acts in this country. So how can they think themselves as human advocates and at the same time quite tolerant of racism? It sounds like a paradox, but my point is that this point is maybe a specificity of racism in France today, and maybe more widely in called democratic countries. So first, let me show you some pictures. So this graffiti, so Muslim with a big cross. This is on the wall of mosque in the city of Saint-Denis in Paris suburb. And this one, so the upper picture is Pas d'Islam chez nous, so no Islam in our country, and this this second picture is France for French. Sorry. Yes. And so it's probably not difficult to imagine that anti-Muslim incidents in France have increased since the 2015 terrorist attack. So you know that one in January against Charlie Hebdo journal, and another one in November, which killed more than 130 persons. And after that, 223% increase of anti-Muslim incident from 2014 to 2016. And this statistic is based on the number of incidents reported to the police. However, there are also, but of course, not all the discrimination is reported to the police. So this statistic is released by an independent organization. And so they counted also the discrimination. So you see that several different anti-Muslim incident. And so what impact does the global refugee crisis have on it? The point I'd like to emphasize is that France isn't really a major destination for 2015 and 16 refugee crisis. As Professor Nishikida showed us yesterday, major countries' destination were Germany and Sweden, and also other 5 countries, but yes. And so the France wasn't a major country for refugee. However, there was a persistence of anti-refugee attitude. So, for example, last in October 2016, I not participated, but I saw. Sorry, not participated, but I saw in Paris one of the demonstration anti-refugee migrants, but they said refugees this time. Yes, and I was very. Yeah, there are so many young people shouting, "We are home here, and we should defend ourselves," and so on. And so, without an important increase in refugee or asylum seekers, there was a persistence of anti-refugee migrant attitude. So, how can we explain this? One of the key factors is that images of a refugee in France today is often associated with Muslim. Most of asylum seekers in last years are from Muslim major countries. So for example, in 2015 and 16, 4 major countries' asylum seekers in Europe came from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan. And the repeated terrorism attack made as you know, the image of Muslim very negative and help the rise of Islamophobia. And needless to say that such a rise of racism and xenophobic movement isn't limited to France. Far-right political parties entered government coalitions in several Western democracies, including Australia, and across Europe, there average share of the vote in national and European election has more than doubled since the 1960s, from around 5% to 13% at the expense of center parties. So faced with such a phenomenon, many researches have been carried out to make clear this mechanism and the background, and these researches made several important findings. Among the demand side analysis, there are two main theories: economic insecurity perspective and cultural backlash perspective. And among the supply side analysis, the major one is analysis of far-right wing party strategies. However, our point is that we also need to see other reasons, and so that's why our research focused on the role of the state and the impact of immigration policies over last decades. These policies in the democratic countries are not considered as obviously xenophobic or explicitly racist. But our hypothesis is that during last decades, the migration has become more and more the subject of securitization in these democratic countries. And these not obviously racist immigration policies and border controls policies actually frame and shape the migrant perception in these developed societies. So let's take a closer look at these border control policies. So this is international migration flows. The data was just before the Syrian refugee crisis in 2015. But the total global trends haven't really changed. And so there are point? Do you think there's a point here? At this? Yes. Oh, okay, thank you. Okay, yes. So there are two types of lines, so bold line and more fine lines. But the difference of two types of line is not about the amount of number of refugees, migration flows, but the bold one is intercontinental flow, and the fine one is regional intercontinental flow. And a widely held idea is that most of migration flows are intercontinental migrations, and they move from south to north. But actually, most of migration flows are not intercontinental, but intercontinental and regional. And most of them move from south to south in terms of number. Let me show. I'm sorry, there is some problem. I'm sorry, maybe I touch. Okay, that's what I try to say, that actually, so I'm sorry for this incident. Anyway, so actually, for example, we very often, thank you. Yes. This. Yes. Thank you. Yes, and so, for example, this is a map released by UNHCR, and we very often talk about the refugee crisis in Europe as if most of them came to Europe, but it is not true, as Professor Emery Akari yesterday showed us with Syrian refugee in Turkey. But based on this kind of myth, European countries, in order to fight against this invasion, made great effort to build walls over last decade. Let's take a look at this map. walls have been built not only in Europe but all over the world. But however, so this is Europe, and so it's quite concentrated in this part of Europe on the European borders. And also the circle signify the number of migrants who, by trying to pass the borders, actually died. So my point is that so many money spent to build and maintain the walls. In addition to the wall and barriers, there are also other tools to control borders and migrations. This map on the right showed us where are located European border crossing points. Contrary to widely held belief, borders are not at the edge, only at the edge, and not look like a wall. Actually, border crossing points are also inside the borders. So it's a little bit small, but there are so many border crossing points inside, all across Europe. Like airports or train stations, there are border crossing points. So borders are not linear, but so many dot or points. And the map on the, this is the border, I'm sorry. So the right this is a crossing point. And other one on the left is that where are located the detention centers or detention camp for undocumented migrants, very often called illegal migrants. And as you see, these facilities, okay, thank you, not only inside Europe, but also outside of Europe here, so the externalization of migration control outside the European borders. And so all these examples, we can call this, Fortress Europe. And it also shows us how much energy, effort, and money European Union has expended and keep expending to control migrations, and how much the migrants are considered as threat or danger today, and how these migrants are securitized in Europe and its policies. Another point is that not all foreigners are the subject of such a securitization. European immigration policies are not only restrictive. Some people can very easily, and maybe more easily than before, cross the borders. And for others, it's very difficult and more difficult. So it is about the bipolarization of border controls between rich and poor, and between developed countries' citizens and others. And what is important is two aspects of this bipolarization are part of the same mechanism, and they made the same system. And also what is important is this bipolarization, so social and economic geographic inequality actually intersects with race, racial, ethnic, and religious discrimination. Actually, their immigration policies are not to control all foreigners, but some categories of foreigners, and these policies not only securitize them, but by always associating them with threat, danger, insecurity, and crime, they criminalize them, and especially after recent terrorist attack in France. So some people probably think that given the current international context, political context, these policies are inevitable and there is no alternative. For example, Europe doesn't have the capacity to welcome this influx of all migrants given the economic crisis, or to stop invasion of these migrants walls are necessary and very useful, and so on. But however, more and more migration studies today showed us that there is really no evidence for support of this thesis. These findings showed that immigration policies are frequently framed and shaped more by fear and stereotype today than by empirical evidence. It's not a real necessity, but it's about more a political choice. So making immigrants the scapegoat for all that doesn't work may result in payback in the election. In Europe, political xenophobia is not limited to openly xenophobic parties today. It is more and more, unfortunately, national policy. But in the long-term perspective, it doesn't help us to build a safer and less divided society. Focusing on migration issues as a source of danger is a dangerous political strategy. So conclusion of this presentation is that the states and their immigration policies securitizing and criminalizing some categories of migrants have framed the way that migrants are perceived in France and in Europe. And this has a lot of impact on the rise of anti-migrant sentiment and attitude. So the state have important responsibility. But having responsibilities means they can change the situation. So we need to provide empirical evidence and to pressure the state to choose another immigration policies. And just the last, I'm sorry. This is I put this picture because I talked today about the Japanese, didn't talk about the Japanese case, and Professor Chong will talk later, but just a small mention. So this is a illustration, very controversial illustration in Japan in 2015 after the European refugee crisis. So you know this is a, I mean, it's weird to say real picture, but this is a photo of a Syrian girl made by a photograph. And this is a Japanese female illustrator, apparently, seemingly inspired from these pictures and made this illustration. So I translated what is written here, but my point is, so it's a little bit much more the bridge to the presentation to Professor Chong, but the racism is everywhere, and we have to do something. This is my conclusion. Thank you for your...
Thank you very much. The next presenter is Professor Chong Yong-fan. He's a professor of Meiji Gakuin University in its the Yokohama campus. He studied actually, I think, at the Hitotsubashi University. He's a social historian focused on the Koreans in Japan and then other Japanese and Korean history. You have 20 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Chong Yong-fan from Meiji Gakuin University in Japan. Now, I appreciate having the very great opportunity for me to give this research talk. And so I'm also feel nervous, but of course I will do my best. Also, we talk about the different region, but I think there is a common element, such as secularization of discourse about migrant or refugee. And as introduced, I'm teaching and majored in contemporary Korean history. My main area of interest is the history of Koreans in Japan and the history of immigrant policy of Japan. And particularly, I focused on the social history of Korean after the liberation of Korea. So to discuss our panel's topics, dealing with the anti-refugee or migrant sentiments, my presentation concerns the history of the Koreans in Japan and Japanese racism. especially those who support the DPRK. Since 2006, Japanese government have been imposing economic sanction against DPRK. DPRK is Democratic People's Republic of Korea, so North Korea. And this economic sanction includes a ban on the re-entry of North Korean authority officials residing in Japan with an aim to go to North Korea. So it's North Korean authority means the chairman and vice chairman of the General Association of Korean Residents in Japan, so-called Chonryun in Korean language, who are also members of the Supreme People's Assembly. It is legislative body of North Korea. So the recent, that is very new situation, and so I think that is a very crucial point of the Japanese foreigner or Korean sentiment. So the recent research on the anti-refugee or migrant sentiment in Japan focused on the racist movement from below. According to Professor Naoto Higuchi, who is a Japanese sociologist, a recent anti-refugee migrant sentiment have a psychological basis on the emotional backlash against the criticize on Japan's wartime aggression and colonial rule from neighbor Asian countries. So rather than economic factors such as fear of losing jobs to foreigner. So I agree that this argumentation because the recent Japanese racism and xenophobia are targeting Koreans, the old-comer Koreans, and in many cases, it has been accompanied by the historical revisionism. In particular, so very famous chauvinist organization, so Zaitokukai is, this is best known anti-foreigner organization. It means a citizen group. It means a citizen group that will not forgive special privilege for Koreans in Japan. It's named the Zaitokukai. The Zaitokukai call for the end to welfare and other privileges afforded to about 500,000 non-naturalized members of Japan's ethnic Korean community. In particular, they are insisting the abolition of special permanent resident permit, which targets Korean and Taiwanese who have been in Japan since before 1945. Sorry. Okay, yeah. In their Zaitokukai demonstrations, often in part of cities such as Tokyo and Osaka with large Korean populations, they have described ethnic Koreans as criminals or cockroaches and call for them to be killed. Indeed, Zaitokukai have been targeting not only Koreans. In 2009, they demonstrated to claim the deportation the 30-year-old daughter of illegal Filipino immigrants and marched around her school. But as their name suggests, their main target is the old-comer Koreans. And on the other hand, it seems that the future of recent anti-refugee or migrant sentiment against Korean is backlash against the achievement of Zionist Koreans in Japan, Koreans liberation movement. Furthermore, what is the more serious is that the racist group encouraged by the government policy, such as acceptation of the historical revisionism or the denial of Koreans' educational rights and the economic sanction against the DPRK. So there are, for instance, there are Korean schools in Japan and in about 60 different locations in Japan, where some 7,000 students are currently enrolled. The students have South Korean nationality or Chosen nationality, but I will explain later this term, and Japanese nationality. the complex upbringing as an ethnic minority in Japan and education in Korean schools contribute to the development of their ethnic identity. And most types of schools have been managed by the General Association of Korean Residents in Japan, so Chonryun, the pro-North Korean ethnic organization. There still, but persistently remains discrimination and prejudice against Korean school, which has been further fueled by anti-North Korean sentiments perpetuated by the media, as well as lack of understanding on Koreans in Japan among the general public. And the Korean schools have been the main target of racist group attack by xenophobic groups or individuals, both on the streets and on the internet. Also, issue of hate crime and hate speech against Koreans are not at all new phenomenon in Japan, but it has become unprecedentedly prevalent in the recent years with the rise of Zaitokukai. So that is why my presentation focused on the anti-North Korean sentiment and racism from above. So firstly, I would like to start with this question. Who are North Korean nationals in Japan? And to begin with, we have to date back to the colonial era to understand the origin of the Koreans in Japan. It seems that one of the distinctive features of modern Korean history was that many people had experienced the leaving their own hometown. And the population of Korean living abroad increased consistently. In its early stage, the dominant destination were China, especially Manchuria and Far East Russia. So the table 1 shows the change of population of Koreans in Japan from 1910 to 2010. As shown in this figure, World War I triggered an increase in number of the Korean immigrants to Japan. And after 1920s, the number had been increasing as a consequence of colonial agricultural policy, which brought Korean peasants to ruin. Moreover, on 1930s, the Japanese government has launched fully forced mobilization of Koreans toward Manchuria, Inner China, Southeast Asia, and Japan. As a result, in 1943, the population of Korean abroad had reached about 4 million. Among them, Koreans in Japan occupied most populous group. And just after the end of World War II, some 1,030,000 Koreans repatriated to Korea, mainly South Korea. And about 600,000 remained in Japan for some reason. The reason of fear for life in Korea and the US military government's policy, so they could not bring their property rather than their hand-carried baggage when they repatriated to Korea. And after Korea War broke out, they could not repatriate their country. After Japan surrendered to the Allied forces, some 600,000 Koreans remained in Japan. So they are now called Zainichi Koreans. The word Zainichi is the Japanese word for living in Japan. So Zainichi Korean means the Korean residents in Japan. Okay. The table 2 shows the change of the foreign population in Japan from 1947 to 2010. As shown in this figure, until 1990s, the vast majority group of foreign people were Koreans. Thus, during the post-war era, especially in the first decade, the Japanese policy towards foreigners would have meant the policy against Koreans. In addition, looking at this demographically, Koreans from southern area in Korean Peninsula, namely compose 100,000 or about 90% of the population. So it means most Koreans in Japan are from the today's South Korea. However, the table 3, this is a Korean population in Japan by nationality from 1947 to 2050, shows that until 1970s, more than half of Koreans were registered as a Chosen. Chosen means Korea, not South Korea. It means, by their own, by their alien registration card in Japan. So why did these type of things occur? I think to answer this question, I have to explain the post-war Japan's citizenship policies. So in 1947, the Japanese Diet passed the alien registration law that identified Korean as belonging to Chosen. It's Japanese word, it means Korea. Based on their family registers and required Koreans to carry alien registration card at all times. Okay. This picture is only alien registration card issued by Kyoto City government in 1949. Please look at the nationality column of this card. Here. There is a word, Chosen. It means Korea. And right side of this words, it says that native place. So the word Chosen in the alien registration card just means Korea as a region. It did not mean North Korea. So to explain why this term appeared in the alien registration system in Japan, I will direct my attention to the continuity of Japanese colonialism. So Japanese rule of Korea officially ended upon signing the instrument of surrender in which they promised to follow the provisions in the Potsdam Declaration in good faith on September 2, 1945. And Japan had also lost their most colonial territories, such as Taiwan, Sakhalin, and of course Korea. But focused on the policy against Japan's Zionist Korean community before and after 1945, it comes in sight of other historical aspects. After the Japan's defeat on August 1945, Korea had become independent from Japan. The Korean people think so. And Japanese forces retreat from Korea. Also, the two governments were established in 1948 with the boundary at the 38th parallel. That is, independence had already materialized. However, it's very important. At that time, in 1945, Japanese government did not acknowledge Korea as an independent state. From Japanese government's viewpoint, Korea's independence from Japan was not recognized until the time when the peace treaty would put into effect. In fact, until the treaty went into effect in April 1952, Japanese government defended the sovereignty rights of their former colony. Therefore, according to this legal interpretation of Japan, the legal status of the former colony subject also did not change after the defeat. Of course, actually, it is some kind of legal fiction for the people in Korea. But for the Koreans in Japan, this interpretation was a hard fact. Japan considered the Koreans in Japan as a colonial subject to control their social liberation movement, such as former forced labor dispute at the coal mine, the campaign to free political prisoners, or the demanding fair treatment as a liberated people. And therefore, even though Japanese army defeated in 1945, the independence remains a task that need to accomplish for the Koreans in Japan. That being so, why this time Chosen have remained after the peace treaty came into effect after 1952? The first Japanese and at first Japanese and South Korean government tried to resolve the citizenship issue, national citizenship problem of Koreans in Japan, granted South Korean nationality to all Koreans. But Korea and Japan negotiation broke down, and although this attempt resulted in failure, in 1952, when the San Francisco Peace Treaty took effect, Chinese Koreans lost their Japanese nationality. And those who could not or did not go back to the Korean Peninsula became de facto stateless people. As foreigners, they were allowed to apply for citizenship by the naturalization process. In addition, there are ultimate reasons why a large number of people supported the North Korea. The Korean language school was established immediately after liberation in 1945 and gradually developed into regular school. In the early years, Koreans in Japan learned autonomous school without any support or protection from their homeland because there was no government established in the Korean Peninsula at that time. Meanwhile, that tension was escalating in the Korean Peninsula, and the two states were eventually established in 1948. And the Koreans organization, the governing body of Korean school, expressed its support for the socialist communist DPRK. Fearing that this organization and the Korean school were hotbeds for communist indoctrination, the GHQ, so U.S. military government. And the Japanese government ordered this Korean organization be dissolved, and the Korean school took close in 1949. In 1955, a new Zionist Korean organization, so this is a General Association of Korean Residents in Japan, and in support of DPRK, was founded. Under the leadership of Chon Ryun, the Korean education was quickly institutionalized and became the foundation of today's Korean schools. For decades, the DPRK government was the sole political entity that showed interest in developing Korean education in Japan and provided various forms of invaluable support. In particular, in 1957, just 4 years after the armistice was signed, while the DPRK government was in the midst of financial difficulty, it said 2 billion yen to support the Korean school. This support means more than just money. This strong tie with the homeland also helped Koreans in Japan emotionally as they struggled to protect their school in the face of discrimination and suppression. So this is why so many Koreans had been supporting DPRK. Okay, my presentation traced the history of this ambiguous political category of Korea, also Chosen, and examine the ways in which the Chosen-seki Koreans have been subject to. Also, Japanese government defines Chosen-seki as a mere indication of one's or his ancestors' country of origin. It's similar to North-Korea conflates Chosen-seki with North Korea. This has further marginalization and deprivation of rights and privilege of the Chosen-seki Koreans in post-World War II Japan. So far, we have been discussing the brief history of the Zionist Korean community. Now, 7 decades have passed over the years. The situation around Koreans in Japan and foreign people have changed greatly, as have generations of people in Japan. However, after 1990s, especially after 2002, the abduction issue came to light, and mounting over here in North Korea's development of nuclear missiles. And the relationship between the Korean school and the DPRK is seen negatively in Japan, and sometimes become a basis for discriminative policies. So this is today's Korean schools picture. Yeah. there is Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il's picture. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. In Japan, the system for legally guaranteeing ethnic education has not been formulated. Thus, the DPRK government and the Korean organization have played a major role. Today, Korean school students visit the DPRK on a school trip, and some even participate in the special education program during the summer holiday. However, the Korean schools have been discriminated against Japanese government to this date. For instance, the issue of tuition waiver program constitutes one such a problem. In 2010, Japan has enacted the law to eliminate high school tuition fees. The law effectively eliminates tuition fees at public high schools and provides tuition aid to students attending private high school, including the student of for foreigners. Okay, yeah. But it has sparked controversy over the inclusion of pro-North Korean high schools. And in consequence, the Korean school excluded this tuition waiver program. So it seemed de facto sanction against DPRK for Japanese conservative politician. As a result, the student brought a case to trial. Yeah. And after late 1960s, Chonryun tried to get, the Korean organization tried to get Japanese government to recognize Chosenseki or Koreans as North Korean nationals. Also, this attempt resulted in failure, but some progressive leftist local governments recognized their legal status and dispersed the subsidies for Korean school. So, in conclusion, based on the above, it seems that the future of recent anti-refugee migrant sentiment against Koreans in Japan is not only the continuity of colonialism, but also the backlash against the achievement of this kind of Zionist Korean movement. Yeah, thank you very much.